Good evening, wisdom seekers, and welcome to episode 3 of the Wisdom Podcast from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAM for short. You can find us over at angermanage.co.uk, and you can subscribe to the Wisdom Track now on Apple Podcasts. Just search for the Wisdom Track. So today we're talking about the fictitious mind. All of us follow an inner narrative dictated by our impression of events and the people we encounter. The inner narrative assists in the daily task, the arduous daily task of reconciling emotion-provoking stimuli. But this reconciliation may not be possible sometimes, or certainly not cut and dried. In a perfect world, intellect, emotion, and moral values would work in harmony. But human beings are yet to discover a perfect world, both externally and internally. So faced with an incomplete version of events, our mind often fills in the blanks. And unfortunately, things like imagination, fear, and hysteria get involved. And we wind ourselves up or otherwise get ourselves into a bit of a pickle, which could even end up with sort of living a lie to the extent of paranoia. Now, how can we determine fact from the fictitious mind? Helping me get to the bottom of that today. Firstly, can I introduce Mike Fisher? Mike is the founder of BAM and is internationally recognized as the leading voice in the field of anger management. He's the best-selling author of Beating Anger and Mindfulness and the Art of Managing Anger, and he's the guy who's brought us all here today. Hey, Mike, and thanks very much for all your efforts putting the Wisdom Podcast together. Now, it looks like you're somewhere really boring, but you're actually not, are you? You're on safari in Kenya, yeah? And you saw some wonderful things today. Tell the audience about that.
Well, it's actually been an epic journey. I've just flown into Amboseli, which is just under Mount Kilimanjaro. And our first experience was flamingos. Our second experience was zebras fighting and dusting, high up, reaching high up into the above the clouds. And then, of course, we had this extraordinary troop of bull elephants, about 30 of them walking towards the waterhole, which was just extraordinary, talking about non-fictitious mind, because that certainly was real.
Why would 30 bull elephants all be hanging out together, or is that a mystery of nature?
Steve, it's unusual. In fact, one of the things we were told is usually you'll find 5 or 6 bulls, but in this case I think it was about 30 or possibly even slightly more, but it was unusual to see so many of them. But can't answer that question.
Absolutely. Maybe next month we'll have the answer. So also joining us on the panel today, Craig Snake Bloomstrand. So Craig's work at Folsom Prison in America inspired the award-winning documentary The Work, now available as of this week on Amazon Prime. He also works with Special Forces veterans and regular foot soldiers in the battle of life. His book, Every Story Comes to an End, is out now. Hey, Snake, how you doing today?
Doing great. Glad to join you.
Thanks for being here, Snake. Now, our special guest today is Katie Moran. Katie is a leading figure in the return of painting to international contemporary art. Her paintings are complex abstracts created using a process led by spontaneity, instinct, and emotion. She's represented by Stuart Shave Modern Art in London and Andrea Rosen in New York. And if you know anything about this kind of thing, that's pretty prestigious. So head there if you'd like to buy some of her work. And hello, Katie, and thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Hi, Steve.
So, Mike, maybe we could begin by you telling us sort of what the fictitious mind is. You came up with the phrase, so over to you.
So, this Snake and I often have these long, detailed conversations. And I think one of the conversations sparked off this idea of the stories that we tell ourselves. And we never investigate whether there's any evidence about whether those stories are true or not true. And in my work as a therapist, I speak to and I spend so much time with people who make up these extraordinary stories, and they never really take the opportunity to investigate how accurate and how true they are. So for me, the way I saw it is like we create fiction. We have this kind of internal biography, which is based on stories that we tell ourselves, whether, of course, the stories are true or not true. They're still fiction on some level. But I also like this idea. It's biographical. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's factual. So it could be defined as fictitious.
Okay. Now, why do we do this?
Look, I think it has a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said about our own history,
Okay.
our own childhoods and traumatic childhoods, which essentially shaped and, of course, unshaped who we are today. So there's something about how the stories that we tell ourselves are really emerge based on the way that we defend ourselves from reality, from the truth of reality, whatever that reality is. So it's part and parcel of our defense mechanisms. You know, that's how I understand it. And it is part of the way that we've survived.
Okay.
Otherwise, what gets in the way, if I can finish, otherwise what gets in the way is that something takes over and it's more negative than it's positive. And it needs to be evidenced, whether it's fact or whether it's fiction.
Okay. Panel, by the way, turn your phones off. And so, Mike, when we were talking about how to confront the fictitious mind just before the show, you were saying that one of the ways what we could sort of work out fact from fiction was by having a big group therapy session in which we all told each other what we thought of each other. Now, that sounds absolutely terrifying to me. And is this why we maybe give our fictitious mind a pass? Is it why the fictitious mind has such a lot of control? Because confronting the reality we find so terrifying.
Well, look, you know, it's interesting because when I mentioned that to you, I remember your response, just thinking about, could you imagine 5 or 10 people telling you your positive qualities and your negative qualities? And it has to be at least more than 3 individuals that you might know. But I think there's something quite terrifying about that experiment, because I remember when I was training as a therapist, or in fact, as training as a group facilitator, one of the questions that was asked to me, have you ever asked people how they experience you, how they see you? And it's like, oh my God, are you crazy? I can never ask a question like that. So you can imagine, it just kind of brings up like everything that I dislike about myself, but actually it could be quite positive. And having said that, you know, think about the hot seat process snake.
Yep.
When men step into the leadership role in the MKP, that is in itself, you know, a terrifying experience. And actually, Steve, maybe Snake can talk a little bit about that as well, because that would also be interesting. Yeah.
About the hot seat experience.
Yeah, the hot seat process.
Snake, what on earth is the hot seat experience?
I'd love to jump in on that. And, you know, it hits into one of the ways we vet the stories of the fictitious mind. Now, inside my head, I can make up all kinds of stories endlessly and do. And to a certain degree, it's about orienting in the world, in my world. And yeah, like Mike says, some of it's based on past experience, some of it's imagination. It comes from a lot of different places. But one of the most powerful ways I've found to vet those stories is in that hot seat process, where there'll be maybe 10 people gathered up, and the idea is to hear your negative impact on those people in the circle and your positive impact. And what I've always found curious is the negative one comes as no surprise, because a lot of times we're beating ourselves up. It's the positive feedback around how you've really impacted people's lives in a positive way that's hard to swallow, that's hard to digest. It's a really good example of how the fictitious mind has 2 different edges to it. One, a story that's really hard on us. Another is a story how we're really seen from the outside looking in. And it tends to be a lot more positive than the dark one we paint of ourselves. It's incredibly eye-opening, particularly if you're sitting with people that you know are not bullshitting you. There's really nowhere to go. If someone says, no, I really appreciate you're a really good person, and it's a person you trust, that they're not just lying to you or trying to get something from you, there's little place to go but consider that maybe this is true.
And what does it, sorry.
And so when I say vetting the stories that I make up, I've found the best place to do that in the company of good friends that I trust.
And how can we be more comfortable with the positive things that the fictitious mind might say to us? I mean, my fictitious mind is like a particularly aggressive and out of control PE teacher that chides me for every sort of inconsistency, and you know, losing the keys, you know, is a complete crisis, and things like this. How can we be more? What does it say about us that we won't let the positive voice come through? And how is there a way that we can make it a bit easier?
Well, I think it's practice. I really do. For whatever reason, so many of us grew up in an imperfect world where judging yourself meant greater performance, better competitors. It meant achievement. It meant a whole bunch of different things that being a good person didn't necessarily pay off.
Mm-hmm.
So as we balance those two things out, a harsh critical view of ourselves and a more positive view of ourselves, over time balancing that out is somewhat countercultural and from the culture we grew up in.
Sure.
I'm speaking for myself anyway.
Yeah.
It was far easier to believe the places I came up short than the places I excelled.
Right.
And so practice and having people pushing me out there every so often saying, no, really, you got this. Trust me on it. Strengthen my own self-confidence as well.
So
I mean,
sorry, mate, go on.
I'm a recovering shy Norwegian Lutheran. And I talk to people day in and day out. And a lot of that came because people said, you know, I got something out of what you were saying. I appreciate that. That built my confidence and eroded the negative stories.
Well, you certainly wrote a fantastic piece on the fictitious mind, which everyone, by the way, can read right now over on our blog at angermanage.co.uk. But you ended up that feature by explaining how the fictitious mind can have some very positive effects on things like ambition and creativity. Do you want to talk a bit about that right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of the negative self-talk that goes on is about the past. And the fictitious mind is brilliant when it comes to imagining what the possibilities are for the future. It's a matched set of horses with just one horse pulling you go in circles. Put them together. Teach those horses to walk together.
Right, I see. So, Katie, as an artist, how much do you find the internal narrative informing your work or your process?
Great question, Steve. Thank you.
Cheers, mate.
The inner narrative.
Yeah.
You say, yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, I spend a lot of time by myself in the studio, so I have to develop my inner narrative. But I have been thinking about the fictitious mind mainly in positive terms, and the potential of the mind. And I first experienced the potential of the mind through sport. I used to race competitively when I was younger. Mm-hmm. And that led me to be interested in sports psychology and positive visualization and hypnosis. And then in the last couple of years, I discovered The Secret and the law of attraction and quantum physics. and personal development companies like Mind Valley. And so I became very interested in the mind and thinking of my life and my work in more holistic terms. And there was a lot of phrases being bandied about, like, you know, the mind is the last frontier. The conscious mind is 5% of who we really are. And for a long time now in my process, I've been interested in utilizing conscious will and control, but equally trying to open up a space for ideas from the unconscious mind and imagery from the intuitive mind and the interior self, like you're talking about the inner narrative, and the possibility of a collective unconscious that the philosopher Carl Jung talks about. And so I've been interested in these alternate states. And about a year or so ago, I was interested in trying to cultivate a kind of hypersensitivity to my surroundings and other people's paintings.
Okay.
And I was reading a book about British singer-songwriters recently, and it was talking about inspiration, and it was talking about Robin Gibb from the Bee Gees, how he could hear melody in ambient sounds like church bells, and how John Lydon could pick out a tune in a traffic jam, you know, from the horns beeping. And this kind of sensitivity to inspiration, you know, you can enjoy the magic of that and the mystery of that, or you can experiment with it and try and cultivate it. And I did a lot of guided meditation and yin yoga and trying to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And I did a lot of cloud staring, which I now know has an official term, skyology. Anyway, I was driving to London one day and I was struck by the beauty of an electricity pylon. And I've never found beauty in electricity pylons. And then, for instance, I was interested and saw amazing beauty in a, pardon the pun, bog standard toilet, and Marcel Duchamp permitting. And I kind of thought, this is working. And I would go around the Tate and I kind of feel high on these paintings. And Picasso famously talks about returning to the eyes of a child. And in this way, yeah, I suppose I saw it as a kind of self-cleaning. And I'm not suggesting I got anywhere near this, but I was interested in this notion of this attainment of rebirth, of a rebirth. But, you know, artists have experimented with the mind and alternate states throughout history. Salvador Dali trained himself to fall asleep for a quarter of a second to try and access
Really?
greater.
I've never heard that. A quarter of a second. How did you? Okay.
Yeah, psychologists at the time called it the hypnagogic state.
Right.
And basically he'd fall asleep for a quarter of a second, and he believed this gave him insight into greater intuition and creativity.
Right.
And this, like I say, at Mind Valley, the creator of Mind Valley, Vishen Lakhiani, talks about reprogramming the mind to access basically the 4 different brainwave states that we reside in: alpha, beta, theta, delta. And he said that we can learn how to program the mind to access them at will. He also talks about this concept of bending reality, which is interesting. And he cites Steve Jobs and Rockefeller as being masters at bending reality. When you talk about the fictitious mind, Walter Isaacson wrote a book on a biography on Steve Jobs, and he said at the root of Steve Jobs' reality distortion was the belief that the rules didn't apply to him and he could bend reality to his desires. He witnessed it in childhood, and that he was the chosen one. He saw people like Gandhi and Einstein as the chosen people, and he believed he was one of them. But yeah, this idea that you can bend reality to your desires, and there's this feeling now that we can create our own reality. We can be architects of our own life. And I think you were touching on this, Snake and Mike, that, you know, basically our belief systems make up our reality. And one way to bend your reality is by clearing out old belief systems and replacing them with new belief systems. And that's one way to kind of create your own reality. So yeah, it's this idea that the fictitious mind comes well, it's basically very malleable, and this idea that it preempts manifesting the reality. The fictitious mind, in terms of positive visualization and imagining and becoming the person or the things that you want to manifest, to then you actually manifest them. Yeah.
Lots of fascinating stuff there. Loads of questions I want to ask. But guys, what there do you want to talk about a bit further, or maybe ask Katie a bit more about?
Well, I'm curious, Katie, about how that's then shaped, you know, all the research that you've been doing, how that is then reshaped or shaped your work and your painting in terms of your own inner narrative. Coming back to that conversation.
It's really helped me, Mike, because I think this internal narrative and this interior self and this trying to open up the space for different things to come in, like I was saying to you, intuition, the conscious mind, conscious will and intention, the unconscious, the collective unconscious, you know, all these things. But Carl Jung talks about it in a way that resonates with me, this idea that we are made up of many selves. And he talks about this second self, and this second self is old and wise and connected to the elements and nature and time. And it's very different to our ego and, you know, the physical person that we are in the world. But he says that if you can access this and allow it to exist alongside the ego, then you can tap into this vast array of rich imagery and ideas and intuition and creativity. But you have to, allow it to coexist alongside the ego. But also in terms of the fictitious mind, when it becomes detrimental, he says the creative person is aware of the many selves and is able to harness the plurality of that.
Yeah.
But the mentally unwell person is aware of the many selves, but it causes chaos and paranoia and dissociation. And that's when it becomes detrimental.
If I can just interrupt, sorry, can I interrupt you?
Oh, I finished.
Oh, okay. So it in a way, Snake, it kind of comes back to some of the conversations we've already had on these podcasts, which is around the observer, the wise being. And I'm just thinking about that, you know, that part of me, the observer, the kind of the silent witness who seems to know everything about me. And yet, you know, I grapple with my own reality. And I'm just thinking about, I did a week summer school on digital art in mold making in a digital age. So it was going back to these incredible technologies that we haven't used or we've lost sight of, certainly within the context of architecture. And it was a week-long project. And for me, my learning curve was unbelievably steep. You know, first time I'd ever worked in plaster or in lost wax or in silicone or in resin. And the stories that came up, all my insecure stories that came up were just absolutely unbelievable. And at the same time, I still had this observer observing the bullshit that I was feeding myself. And I finally kind of made a lot of sense of it a couple of days after that week intense. But I must just tell you, what was really interesting about this particular experience for me, I think is probably some of the best work that I've done in years, simply because I was so anxious and so torn and so split between what I would say the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and of course, all the stories I told myself based on my own historical insecurities. And I had to keep reassuring myself that, Michael, this is just noise in your head. This has nothing to do with you. And yet it kind of lies there buried, just waiting to emerge. And of course, the witness in me is given this amazing opportunity to just carefully and gently remind that part of me. So, when you talk about the many selves, that part of me that it's okay, Mike, and reassure myself. But it's amazing how insecure I felt during the week. And yet at the end of the week, what I produced was fantastic.
Well, I mean,
even if I made it myself.
I mean, it sounds like your negative in a narrative is producing results, right? Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I know professionals who dive into their own neuroses because they think that's the safest way for them to act going forward, is to be neurotic all the time and be nervous all the time and worry all the time, because then they can head off any issues at the pass.
I had a nice reminder a few weeks ago that the ego isn't just the self-inflated side of yourself, the self-inflated perception of yourself, but it's the neurotic side of yourself. And that was a really nice reminder, because it just reminds you that you don't need to feed it. And so when it happens, you can realize what it is. And just like you wouldn't want to entertain grandiose ideas of yourself, that I think sometimes in society we've been led to believe that it's somehow admirable to have this neurotic side of ourselves, but it's really not. It's just as bad as the grandiose side.
Snake, in America, does this happen, or are people better at listening to their positive inner voice?
Yeah, I mean,
is it because we're British?
No.
And in America, are people better at listening to the positive side of their inner voice?
No, I think it's universal.
I know that's a bit of a generalization. But.
Yeah, it's universal. But, just listening to both those comments, I'm thinking about how often we take and put a value judgment, good or bad. When it's a soup, it's both. And developing a sense of humor and a sense of understanding when those narratives show up that are goofy or don't serve in some way or another, that's a process of maturing and coming to know yourself. There isn't a psychological roadmap that we can all follow around that. It's an individual process. I say sense of humor because quite often something will come up for me, like Mike's experience in the molding class, and I'll go, "Well, you're back again. What the hell are you doing here again?" And it's some insecurity or something that I outgrew a long time ago, but I don't need to judge it. Simply recognizing it and having a sense of humor around it, remembering where it stubbed my toe or whatever, diffuses it. Where I see dysfunction, particularly in clients, is when they grab onto a story and refuse to allow it to be plastic. That story that I have of insecurity as a child is no longer appropriate. I'm an old man and I've done a lot of different things. Doesn't mean that story went away. Right. But it does mean that when it shows up and wants to be heard, I can hear it, pat it on the head and say, "Not today," a skill I didn't have when I was 20 or 30.
I think
it's that value judgment gets in our way. Is it a good feeling or a bad feeling? It's a feeling. And it comes from a lot of different places. And the fictitious brain is just trying to give you words to be able to articulate what's going on in your body. It's not necessarily accurate or inaccurate.
See, it's slightly frustrating how these stories from childhood, these negative feelings, can still be with us no matter how much we've done to negate them, put them to one side. Mike, what else can we do to stop ourselves going down the negative part of the fictitious?
I think part of it too, just to finish that up, is another side to that whole thing is I'll use a common example. People who were abused as children, physically or emotionally, tend to be incredibly empathic with other people who have suffered similar situations. And so, what we can do with it is a lot of that self talk, positive or negative, serves to make us far more empathic and far more compassionate with one another. So I really believe that oftentimes the gateway to forgiving yourself for your failings is forgiving them in others. Seems far easier and develops a tolerance for being able to hold yourself. You look at other people and you see the many different facets of their personality, and maybe I see one third of mine. I need to count on others to be able to flesh out the rest. And then it's on me to vet which ones I reinforce.
Look at, can I develop on that, Snake?
Yeah.
So, part and parcel of the way that I work is that I'm constantly having to remind the clients that I work with is that they are very skilled at creating obstacles for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the exercises that I've done and that I do is, whether it's in group work or one-to-one work, I'll often say to somebody, why don't you make a list of the things that you really like about yourself? And that takes about like 30 seconds. And now then I say, well, can you also make a list of things that you don't like about yourself? And then that takes about 3 minutes. And it's a much, much longer list. And it's like, from my perspective, the messages that we got as children, we've interjected them, we swallowed them whole, and we believe them because that's, I think, the origins of our own stories within the context of not the positive stories or the healthy stories, but the negative stories. So, I talk about the inner critic or the inner judge, or the silent assassin, who some people have said actually my assassin is not so silent. But I think what's emerging for me is that what is most difficult to do is to be able to differentiate between what is true and what is not true, because we have so many stories, so many rackets that are being played out in my head. And so that's why, coming back to what you were saying, what you discussed in the beginning, wouldn't it be really interesting if we actually did have this hot seating process with 5 or 10 people where we said, well, what are the qualities that you love about me? And what are the qualities that you dislike about me? Mm-hmm. And I remember recently I had a situation, and I think it was part and parcel of developing this idea. A friend of mine actually said to me, well, what do you think of me? And I said to him, you know what? I think you're one of the smartest people I've ever met. I love talking to you. You're really interesting. But you're a Mr. Know-it-all. And that's what irritates me, because he knows everything. I ask him a question, the most obscure question, and he'll give me like a 3-hour discourse on the most vaguest subject in the universe, but he knows so much about so much. But of course, there's a part of me that is so jealous that he's a Mr. Know-it-all, because I'd like to be a Mr. Know-it-all. And of course, I'm not. And so I do think there's something quite beautiful in being able to be that blatantly honest. But at the same time, I felt a bit guilty about being that honest. But yet it's been rolling around in my head for months, possibly years, with this particular. And I hope he's listening right now, actually. But there is something about feeling quite guilty about, not by telling him my truth. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's something to be said about authenticity and honesty, and how we create obstacles that get in our way, that limit us, and we need to begin to challenge that. And by doing that, I think the starting question is, do we have any proof, evidence that I'm a bad person? And Katie is, being British, and you and I living in England for as long as we have, I mean, I imagine you've heard people talking about they hate the idea of feeling or being thought of as a bad person. And of course, what gets raised for me, what exactly is a bad person? People do bad things. It doesn't mean that they're a bad person. So that's what I have to say right now.
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of belief systems that can be challenged and replaced with new belief systems. But from listening to what you say, I mean, you can ask somebody's opinion of what they think of you, but it's just their reality. It's a reality, and it's a subjective reality. It doesn't mean it is reality. Everyone has their own version of reality. So I'm not sure that you ever get truth in that way. You just get someone else's reality.
Yes, but if you
like
ask
Einstein said, reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. But I find that exciting, the potential of that. I don't find it disconcerting that, in that
There's
way.
there's an understanding in that too, at least in the circles that Mike and I have participated in, is you need to consider what's said. You don't need to believe it. When people give you feedback about how they see you, you're right. That is somewhat their projection, and it still has value. If I'm walking around in the world thinking that my skin is white and it's actually blue, and someone says, no, you're blue, it's worthwhile for me to consider that others may see me as blue in spite of my own image. It doesn't
Well, I
mean
suppose
I have to believe it.
Is that what you call a truism, though, rather than other things where you can choose how you react to things?
Right. Yep.
If you were blue, it would be a truism.
And there's an obligation to discard what doesn't fit. It isn't just accepting everything that comes your way, too.
So I've got to admit being a little uncomfortable with this. I can see how it might work. I can see how it would be a good idea, and I can see how probably going to have to do it at some stage. But asking people what they think of you is quite taboo, isn't it? It reminds me of Rick in The Young Ones saying, "Hands up, who likes me?" Mm-hmm. So it's not straightforward, is it? No. Is there anything else that we can maybe consider in terms of the fictitious mind and the reality mind, the real thing? And then I would love to go back to this issue of identity and a fluid identity and a fluid reality, because I think there's interesting stuff to talk about there.
One of the things I'd add in here is, and I'm always looking for the bright side in these things because there is polarity. A brief story in that several years ago, I was really sick with cancer and had to go through a whole regimen of chemo. One of the things that got me through that was stories around shamanic journeys. I was somewhat on one, but I had an intellectual construct, a story inside me that took me away from the very reality of dying and saw it as somewhat of an ordeal as opposed to an ending. Now, that's completely a story that I made up in my head to cope. And so maybe another one of the places to go, besides asking people, what do you think of me, is to really look at metaphor. Literature's full of it, art's full of it throughout all time. Before as many people were literate as they are today, we took that stuff in orally and visually, and it was all metaphor. So perhaps really focusing on making metaphor out of some of the stories that come through in your life is of value as well. I know it's benefited me.
So let me respond to that as well. I mean, earlier on, Snake, you were talking about this notion of duality. Mm-hmm. And in the programs that I deliver, my anger management programs, one of the guidelines that I introduce right at the beginning of the work is the word should, delete it. Delete the word should from your hard drive. Stop using the word should or ought, because it's a very effective way of limiting yourself. That was the first thing I said. Then I also said that take words like good and bad, right, wrong, my fault, your fault, black, white. Yeah. And there are two different paradigms. There's the either or paradigm versus the both and paradigm. The either or paradigm is really about thinking about your world in black and white, right, wrong, good, bad, should, shouldn't. And it's about stop using language which limits you, that creates obstacles for you, and start seeing the world as a both and. So, for example, we can agree to disagree. It's okay to have a different opinion. It's okay to have a different viewpoint. It's okay to have a different value, reality. It doesn't make you a good or a bad person. And so I talk about in my second book specifically duality versus zero duality. So duality is what we call oppositional thinking, where we're constantly in battle with ourselves. Our internal world on some level is a battleground. And it's about actually turning the battleground into paradise, into a fertile landscape, rich in nutrients. And the way that we do that is moving from duality to zero duality, where we begin to notice, I begin to notice the language that I use and how language shapes who I am and shapes my reality. And, I think about that, and keep in mind, sorry, Katie, I think in mind is one of the kids misbehaving, is he? I think about the creative process, and I think that in terms, and like you, I'm an artist, and Snake is an artist as well, but I'm constantly, and when I'm making art, I'm constantly valuing it. And I find it so difficult to move away from valuing it, placing value on it. And the more I'm able to stop doing that, actually, the more spontaneous my work becomes. But I'm relating that to the arts. But actually, when I translate it into the way that I think, and how when I hear people say, never or shouldn't or I mustn't, it's another way of creating these obstacles. And so I think it has a lot to do, Steve, with how we use language and how language creates limitations and obstacles. So it's about reframing our relationship to language and seeing if we can use words that are positive as opposed to negative. So, stop using words like good and bad and right and wrong and my fault and your fault and should and ought that I impose on myself and I impose on others. Because from where I'm sitting, that is incredibly liberating. And, when I teach this to my client group, many people are blown away by that particular way of thinking. It's like, wow, I've never thought of that before. And it is liberating, but it's about embedding it in your psyche. And we live in a world of right and wrong and good and bad and black and white and should and shouldn't. And how do we change that?
Yeah, it sounds like language is a very sort of simple answer, but of course, from neurolinguistic programming, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other slightly more mystical approaches, language and the subconscious are, inextricably and powerfully linked. Guys, we've got a viewer's question from World Without War, who would like to hear Snake talking about his work with prisoners on this particular issue. Are we alluding to everyone in prison says they're innocent? Or are we talking about the things that the guys do to make their life term a bit more bearable? Surely the fictitious mind plays, but a large part in the prison experience. And how about the military experience? Is that the opposite?
Yeah, well, I think there's very real similarities, and part of that too is it's influenced in a big way by the institution. Prison is an institutional. There are institutional rules and laws that influences the narrative, and hence the way people survive inside. The same is true with the military. Where I see a bigger struggle is with men recently released from prison or soldiers ending a 20-year career, and that narrative of the institution is gone. That's when the fictitious mind really needs some discipline, because the world they re-enter looks nothing like where they've survived. And so the influences of our environment are incredibly important. And not just the environment, the institutions that we structure our lives around as well. So certainly there's just as many people, military or prison, with fertile imaginations and struggling to find purpose and mission or just understand what the hell's going on. But the impact of having been institutionalized, whether it's military or prison or working a corporate job, greatly influences the freedom of that fictitious mind and what it considers. So there's a lot to be said around that. But
I'm immediately thinking of all the people who've maybe been made redundant from, like you say, a corporate job, and their
exactly,
reality suddenly shifts
yeah,
remarkably, and the fictitious mind then rushes in to try and create new foundations and new pillars, some of which may be shakier than others.
absolutely. And I think that's why this topic is so relevant right now, is not just the isolation that quarantine has caused, but also the change that's happening in people's careers and how they work and how they are with their kids in so many different ways. All of those changes and adapting to them requires we make a narrative around it in order to understand and to shape it.
Katie, you spoke about a lot of very interesting areas that were informing your own work with your mental state and your approach to your art and your profession. Are there any awesome tips that you can pass on to the viewers from your own reading and your own learning and your own approach that could help them sort of build a new identity, say, post significant change?
Well, I'm not a therapist and I can't prescribe any advice. But I suppose, you know, an artist is supposed to be on a good artist is supposed to be on a quest for truth. And so I think it's interesting to offer things up as a potential for thought, you know, and experimentation. That's what I would say. But, you know, I definitely would veer on the side of the positive mind and utilizing the fictitious mind in a positive way. And I think I was thinking back to when I was in my 20s and I just couldn't, I was trying to break into the art world and it wasn't happening for me. And my fictitious mind for those years was my salvation, you know. It was survival, being able to go into my head, escapism, visualize, imagine things, you know. And it's like that famous story about Jim Carrey. He used to go up to Mulholland Drive every night when he was a struggling actor and visualize getting all these film roles. And then he wrote himself a check for, I think it was $10 million for acting services.
Sure. Yeah.
So he put a date on it, and just before the date, he got given Dumb and Dumber, the film, I think, and he was paid $10 million for it. So I loved the magic, I suppose, and the potential of the fictitious mind in that way. You know, there's a load of stuff about it at the moment, the law of attraction and personal development stuff and quantum physics, you know, this idea that we are the thoughts that we have, what we focus on, we attract, etc., etc. And it seems to feel like you have control in that way. You have an element of control in what you attract to yourself. And like I said, you can become, there's this idea now that you can become an architect of your own reality. So I just think we're learning more and more about the mind and how to access it and the potential of it at different states. And I think it's very interesting. You know, as long as you can keep a positive spin on it, but that's related to mental wellness, I would say. And that's holistic, isn't it?
Yes. You know, it's interesting to pick up on what you've said. I do understand that there is something to be said about you have to, as an artist, if you want to be successful, you have to be positive, because there's so many of us out there, you know, wanting to make a living and wanting the success that great art offers to artists. So I've got that in my head, but I've got something else in my head, which is around, you know, the difference between neurosis and a personality disorder. And I like this definition. Neurosis is there's something wrong with me. somebody has a personality disorder, there's something wrong with everyone else. and I just like that distinction. Now, just to kind of throw a little pebble into the water, when I think people who suffer from shame, toxic shame, what M. Scott Peck suggests is that people who suffer from toxic shame, it's a interface or a blending of neurosis and a personality disorder. So there's not only something wrong with me, but there's something wrong with everybody else. And when I think about, the work that I do within the context of shame, specifically with my generic client group, they are riddled, not necessarily with toxic shame, but they are riddled with shame from one degree to another. And that is unbelievably limiting. And it does kill the creative impulse as far as I'm concerned, because we use ourselves as an enemy of ourselves. We weaponize ourselves and then we turn against ourselves, if that makes sense. And I quite like this word weaponizing, which is being bandied around. And so it's about how do I break that. According to Bradshaw, he talks about the shame that binds you. So when I was listening to you earlier on, and there's something about that word magic that I really, really like, Kate. There's just something quite empowering about it, because with magic, everything is possible. And so, I just think about. Go ahead. I'll be curious your response.
No, carry on. Finish, Mike.
I just think that, I don't want to be cliched about this, but I think there needs to be more magic in the world.
But
what is magic?
That is the strength of the fictitious mind, because inventors and people like that, the whole point is they make something out of nothing, and they had to employ the fictitious mind in the first place, to create that thing. It didn't exist. So whether you call it the fictitious mind or visualization or the imagination
or the magical mind
or the magic, it's what takes humans to the highest limits of achievement, without, and that's the magic, I guess. People who've done phenomenal things, and it all started with an idea or a thought, and it was fictitious. But then
last night you mentioned to me Muhammad Ali and Conor McGregor, and the big sort of combat sports stars, and how they basically say, I am the best, I am the hardest, I am the toughest, I will not give up, I will be champion. And everyone kind of scoffs, and then 5 years later they are.
Well, that's it. It's this unshakable self-belief. And when, a lot of people would say that when the mind believes something, it will come true. It will come to fruition. And, there's been tests done that when athletes visualize running a race in their mind, the actual muscles that they would employ to run that race switch on. They're actually lying still visualizing, but the same muscles switch on. And so this idea that the mind tells the body follows, and it's all these things that you can draw this to you. But I like the boxers because they're so overt with it, this fictitious element, like you say, they just believe it, and then it happens.
I think art is particularly good medium for the fictitious mind. And the example I'll use is I work a lot with metal, with copper and steel, and I'll make little bits that don't really fit together. And my bench will be littered with various different bits, and I'll walk by it 50 times, and I'll walk by it, and there'll be 3 or 4 of the pieces that fit together beautifully, and I've got a completed piece. That, in my mind, is magic. And it also took me not intentionally trying to create anything. It took me recognizing that there was potential there, and that was somewhat imagination. But when those things come together, it feels like magic, like some other force besides me allowed me to see through their eyes for a minute and see this 5, 6 different pieces suddenly constellate. And I think knowing ourselves isn't a dissimilar process. We've got a bench filled with a dozen different random pieces. And if we're lucky, every so often, 3 or 4 of them fit together and you go, oh, now I understand. And so I think art is such a good metaphor. The process of creating art is such a good metaphor for what we do in our lives by way of maturing as well.
Does creating art help the therapeutic process? You know, when you come away from a session and there's a jumble of thoughts up there, and after a while they kind of settle into something that's a bit easier to imbibe. Does the artistic process help with that?
It's critical for me. It is my decompression.
So I mean, I'm just loving where this conversation is going. I just love this idea of talking about magic and the way we're talking about magic, and certainly the creative arts. So, you know, I have this view that every time, Steve, that I work with a new group or an individual, it's like a blank canvas. You know, however experienced, I don't know if this is true for you, Snake, but however experienced and however educated I am, it becomes irrelevant, because as soon as somebody introduces a problem or an issue, it is like being faced with a blank canvas. Yep. And the great thing about being a therapist is stay out the fucking way. Mm-hmm. Because you don't want to contaminate, you know, the group that you're working with or the client that you're working with by mixing their colors for them. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something really, really empowering in just getting out the way. And I don't know if this is true for you in the way that you work, Katie, but it's like getting out the way of whatever needs to come through. Something much greater than myself.
It's like a lot of performers talk about that, don't they? And sports people as well, getting themselves out of the way for this other thing to take over. And you know, that's why I'm interested in these alternate states, calling things in that aren't conscious, accident, chance, automatist processes, trying to access images from the unconscious, you know, it's that kind of thing. But it definitely, I suppose the parallel is, for me, painting is infinitely fascinating because there's no formula, like you're saying, Mike, with therapy. With every person, there is no formula. You're never going to crack the code, but that's what's so fascinating, because there's endless potential. But yeah.
So we got a question here from Alan Ignacio, who's asking, do we think the fictitious mind is a combination of different minds from past lives? And if you're not so Buddhist about it, you could talk, is the fictitious mind a combination of epigenetics or the various behavior patterns that have been instilled across the generations?
Well, you know, the jury's out in my fictitious mind over that one. I'm fascinated by it and have personally had experiences where I shake my head and go, where did that come from? Ancient memories, visualization, whatever. I'm fascinated by the topic, and believe or not, I've felt the impact.
You know, it's fascinating because I know the work with Bill Lipton. I think that's his name. Bill Lipton is the father of epigenetics. And, you know, it's interesting because I didn't make the connection between epigenetics within the context of how our thoughts shape who we are. But actually, you know, we're great to have got somebody like Bill Lipton on our show, because he really does talk about what we think and what we believe we become. And, you know, from a scientific perspective, because he's a biologist, when he started introducing this into science, which was, I think, was in the 70s, I mean, he was shunned. I mean, you know, his colleagues just saw him as, you know, the devil incarnate. And yet today, you know, epigenetics is alive and well and really out there. And people are reading the books and they're watching the YouTube videos. And I think there's something to be said about positive psychology, which is what you were talking about earlier on. And quantum physics, what you were talking about earlier on, Katie. So interesting how he arrives in the into the conversation. So I don't think it's really about past lives as such, but I do think it's about transgenerational genetics that have been transferred from one person, from the ancestor all the way to the four of us that are sitting here right now having this conversation.
It fits too with the whole concept of trauma. The epigenetics has opened up this doorway, and there's a side road that says that we've inherited trauma response going back generations and generations and generations. And one of the arguments for that is, a pregnant mother who's under stress passes stress hormones onto the fetus. Now researchers are showing the same is true for the male semen. If a father is incredibly stressed out, he can pass on hormones and stress receptors through in that way. So if we are able to pass trauma on from our parents or receive from our parents, now they're saying you can extend that back to all the grisly trauma that's been witnessed through human history.
Sure.
And we're not fact or fiction here. We're just supposing. And doesn't that all come out of the fictitious mind? Could we think about this in a broader way than we have in the past? I think so.
I mean, Katie, does this feed into what you were thinking about self-reinvention and a blank slate for identity?
I suppose when you were talking, Mike and Snake, it makes me think more about quantum physics and this idea now that everything is energy and is operating at a frequency. Mm-hmm. So in that way, of course, the male sperm or the female hormones would carry a vibration and that would be passed on. So yeah, I'm open to that idea that everything is energy. And so it is plausible that we inherit these things. I don't know that it matters so much because I don't know how we would get the proof for that, but it's probably more about how we go about dealing with them, isn't it?
Mm. It's interesting, too, the last 20 years, the research that's been done in brain science has corroborated a lot of these suppositions that have come up around how our minds function. And so, who knows? Maybe we're just not there yet. But it begins with asking the question, what if?
What if what?
What if everything? It's like, okay. What if I've been wrong about myself all this time? What if I've been wrong about the world all this time? What if I've been right about this all the time? All of that.
Yeah, I think that can be very radical when you do that and you realize you can change your response to everything and in that way change your world, Yeah. It's empowering.
So I like the metaphor around, and I'm no scientist, but that the neural pathways are nothing more than well-worn paths. And if you neglect one, it fades.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the plasticity of the mind. And
sorry,
if you don't use it, lose it.
Yeah.
It reminded me of this, talking about the fictitious mind, this study that was done by Harvard University, and they took a group of 70-year-olds and put them in a 1959 style house with vintage furniture, and they played the music that they heard in their youth. And basically, their physical strength improved, their vision, their memory, their hearing.
Yeah.
But there was this idea that you can trick the brain, and the body follows.
And you can shape the brain as well. That's one of the consequences. You can shape the brain in very effective ways.
What like you're saying with neural pathways, you create new neural pathways. Is it? Yeah.
So I might have mentioned this in one of the presentations before, a fantastic book called It Didn't Start With Me. I can't remember the guy's surname, but his first name is Mark, if anyone wants to read it. And what he's suggesting, the science of it, going back to what you were saying, Snake, is that what they've been able to identify 4 generations of trauma we're carrying. So that's the science of it. And how they did this with this Holocaust survivors and their great-grandchildren. And the similarities in terms of their behaviors, their characters, their mannerisms, and even the way that they actually thought. So often when I'm working with a client or specifically in one-to-one, that is in my awareness that it didn't start with them. So where did it start? Was it 4 generations ago? Because that's as far as we can go. But maybe it is many, many generations. And, we do talk about transgenerational trauma. And how far does that go back?
Yeah.
So there's I'm aware of time, Steve.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that's just kind of come out of this.
Totally. I mean, to
conversation.
start with, the book is It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wallin. Yeah.
Cool.
So everyone knows. But yeah, I mean, fantastic, guys, and probably something what we could go on to talk about identity, perhaps, and restructuring identity and the fluid nature of identity in a future podcast, maybe even the next one. But guys, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and bringing your intellects and your thoughts together with us today. So thank you very much, Katie Moran. Katie, when's your next show? I mean, people having shows right now, private views, stuff like that. Everyone with the mask on in the private view. Have you got anything?
It's going to be an online exhibition.
Sure.
Yeah, it said in the bio that I'm represented with Andrea Rosen, but I'm not anymore. It's actually Sparrow Westwater. That's okay, in New York, and an online exhibition with them. So.
Just repeat the name of the gallery.
Where should people go?
Sparrow Westwater in New York. So it will be an online exhibition, I think, in mid-October.
In mid-October. Thank you so much for joining in today. Really appreciate it. And thank you, of course, Snake Bloomstrand and Mike Fisher. Guys, we're back in October. You can sign up to the YouTube page, and the Facebook is /BAMUK, right? And the YouTube is /BeatingAnger. You can find us on Apple Podcasts. Just search for The Wisdom Track and subscribe. We're going to be back in October. You can sign up to the newsletter at angermanaged.co.uk to find out when. We don't have a date right now, do we, production team? Or do we? Just check. I don't think so.
No, probably in about a month's time.
In the next... We're looking at about the 2nd or 3rd weekend in October.
Yes.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Adios. Ciao.
Mike Fisher has been in the personal and professional development field for over 3 decades. Some of you might know Mike already, attended his anger management programs, or even read some of his books on anger. I'm talking to you today to introduce his new web launch, The Wisdom Track. If you split the word wisdom, you get wise domain. In other words, to inhabit the domain of the wise. And that's the purpose of the Wisdom Track. It's a platform to engage with wise thinking in order to reaffirm who we are in the world and our place in it. It's easy to get lost in the barrage of information that is spewed out to us in every direction daily. But are we able to discern what is true, false, or even critical? We are subjected to the sleights of misinformation with hidden agendas, but do we ever stop to think whether this is enriching the mind or poisoning it? Are we shaping ourselves, or are we allowing all these messages to shape us? Despite all the connectivity of technology, has it in fact made us more vulnerable to being shaped by external forces? And how does this affect our awareness or consciousness, both individually and collectively? You see, there's a personal element to wisdom too. It's different for all of us. It's about finding yourself, knowing what your boundaries and values are, and having a clear dialogue with your inner voice that instinctively knows what's the best course of action for you. We have an inner landscape that is important for us to inhabit, otherwise we lose touch not only with ourselves, but with our place in the world, our purpose, and our environment. We are already witnessing the consequences of this disconnection in our world, the lack of care, respect, and connection towards each other, as well as our one and only planet. COVID-19 has given us a rare opportunity to stop consuming and bring our focus into what is essential. So, what is essential for you? Sometimes becoming wise is about asking different questions. The Wisdom Track platform is a place where we can do all of that, where we get to talk, share, listen, and evolve together.